Dunnota, 3 milk month, 918. I want to be with Edra, I want to be in the scriptorium. It was a complaint that was becoming familiar. That's what the afternoons are for, Osrith told him, as she told him every morning that he didn't want to get up. Now, however, as they passed the ring, warmth from the sun soothing her aching shoulders from sleeping out of doors the previous night, Osrith remembered her heart beating, at the thought that it would soon be over. We're not going to practice today, she told young Finan, for she had been up at dawn and had prepared provisions. Wiher would feed them, when they got to Bibbenberg. It was nearly Street John's Eve. That was the day she told Finan she would be at the cove, the place secluded from the rocks high above, a place where long ago Street Cuthbert had begun a church, made from the natural rock around him, with a place in which to wash and bathe. Fresh water ran into the rock that had weathered into a bowl shape, and Osrith had often imagined, when she had run free that, in sight of Innifarn, Street Cuthbert was there, before her, saying words that even the simplest people could understand, about God, about Jesus, about the saints and the gospel. It had been a letter that had arrived for Sainid that had prompted her to leave. Ragnall and his forces were in the vicinity of Corbridge, a Roman settlement close to the wall, and Constantine and his army were remaining to defend it, with the Mersons and West Saxons. Something to bring them together, Osrith thought, for she knew that, with the cover of impeding battle, her brother would view this as an excellent opportunity to attack Bibbenberg and overthrow Wiher. It was a chance, there was a chance, she thought, as they entered a shallow valley, the ancient hill fort beside them and Bibbenberg in front, that Wiher would not leave, would see the attack as one which he must not be involved in, lest he lost the castle. And another chance that Finan, having got her letter from Eswi, would know she would go there to wait for him. Sainid, of course, tried to stop her. He was waiting at the end of the quay, on the road that led east. I cannot let you, he had told her, holding out an arm, sadly. But Osrith was defiant. You can, she had told him. Edra saw her father. Young Finan needs to see his. We will soon be married, and I don't care about Bibbenberg. You do, Sainid told her, and he caught her lips with his own, pressing to her mouth in a kiss that made her shudder. Young Finan watched his mother, and waited patiently on his pony. Sainid, the feeling was good, which was surprising. Sainid, however, stepped away from her, feeling that his misdemeanor must have overstepped some boundary. I know, not until we are married, he told her. I want that too. But that wasn't what she was going to say. She had thought about the man, sometimes, when she was young, before Constantine had enticed her into his quarters and became her first. He had taken off her battle armor, been the first to glance across her breasts as he dressed her. Sainid thought her a child then, but Osrith had known well he was a man. How well she had arranged her breeches one night, when she had crept up the void above the throne room, and seen Sainid guarding King, as he spoke to his lords. It was just before she had been told to be Constantine's companion, after the battle in which Domhnall had killed Ivar the Boneless. He had been praised by the king, and he had been lauded by the knights. A feeling arose, which Osrith had taken care of when she bore down on the seam, first running it between her legs and then forcing it up hard between her cunt lips, so it rode backwards and forwards in the groove there. Not many pulls were needed until the satisfying feelings ran through her. Sainid had caused that, and she might have done it more, had Constantine not taken her one night, tricking her into his room, and then pushing his cock inside her. Before they had gone to Doir and Nine Fingers had made her feel terrible about herself. Before Domhnall had tricked her into marriage with Guthard. It was much later that Osrith realized the feeling she had elicited in her own body was analogous to what men felt when they pushed inside a woman. I cannot come with you, I cannot, Sainid told her, then kissed her on the forehead. If Constantine asked, you slipped away. By God, be back before he is, he added, glancing to young Finan. And then we can marry. I really don't care about, but Sainid shook his head. Don't tell me that you don't care about Bibbenberg. And then he smiled, and kissed her forehead again. Just return safely, Colleen, you and your son. She could be content with that, Osrith thought, as she watched a horse carry its rider up a small incline. From here, She could see the outline of the east coast, a small grey blot that was Bibbenberg, and to the left, the curve of land that was the island of Lindisfarne. "Where are we going, Mater?" young Finan asked, as they went slowly down the incline. "There is Bibbenberg," Osrith told him, pointing. "Your uncle, Whigger, lives there. Don't you remember him? He was at Dunotter at Eastertide." "I do remember," young Finan told his mother. Osrith turned her head and smiled at her son, before glancing back to the lone figure on horseback. "So I decided it was high time you learned about your family." 88,888,888. "Your brother has sent his men, at Constantine's call," Hald, Whigger's head of guard, told her. He had seen two figures riding towards Bibbenberg and had gone out to assess the threat. When he saw that it was Osrith, he had put his sword away and greeted her warmly. But there was caution in his voice. "To where?" Osrith asked him. "And, he surely must have left guards at Bibbenberg." "He has," Hald told her. "We have sent many. Alba's garrison at Heavenfield has gone, as has Diffenwalls from Caeliquilid." He glanced at young Finan, before adding, "There are Mersins, and West Saxons Sigtrygg's Norse, all united in one cause to protect their interests from Ragnall Livasson, at Corbridge." "Ragnall," Osrith repeated, grimly. So, it had been true. The Norse she had killed not a month before may well have been speaking the truth about their origins. Clearly Ragnall, after all these years, had managed to survive, and survive well, to be able to bring an army to a field of battle with the intention of winning. "What of my other brother?" Osrith asked him. "Have you seen any signs he might be in the locality of Bibbenberg?" And she watched as the old man gave Osrith a huge grin. "We have not," he declared, smiling still broader. "Did you not know? Your brother is off to Frisia." "For a raid?" Osrith asked, the words forming in her mouth as other knowledge stabbed at her brain. "To live, so our Lord Whigger's spies have told him. It is why he has spared soldiers to aid Constantine." And when he touched her arm, Hald gave Osrith a small frown. "They have sold their belongings. There have been inquiries made about land." "They have left Dunham?" "No," Osrith told him, and glanced past Hald, the image of Bibbenberg on the horizon meeting her eye. "Do not take what I say as anything other than advice, sir, but Utad never will give up his claim to Bibbenberg." "Well, well," laughed Hald, clapping on Osrith's shoulder. "I am sorry you think it, but it has been said by many men, and we do have warriors." And Osrith smiled back to him, and nodded, despite her fear. "You are probably right, Hald," she told him. "Whigger will have thought of that." "My thanks, Hald," Osrith added. It was more than the letter had said. She could not go to Street Cuthbert's Cove now with young Finan. He would be beside Utad, who would be beside Lady Ethelfled, no doubt, his plan half forming to dupe his enemies that he was bound for Frisia. She turned to the path they had already taken, glancing over her shoulder to see Hald raise a hand, waving her off. He couldn't know, Osrith thought, as she looked at Bibbenberg again. And Osrith knew that, in a battle involving Ethelfled, Utad would be beside her. Unless Bibbenberg was involved, well, that was a choice. What Osrith did not know was that the next time she saw Hald he would be, well, he would not be in a very healthy position. Riding back half a mile, Osrith would find a road that would take her to the end of the wall. It would take no time for her to ride to Corbridge, which she estimated could not be more than a day's ride. She could get some food and a bed for the night near the wall. Silver paid for a lot of things, as did gold, and Osrith had insured to take with her enough for emergencies, and this was definitely an emergency. She glanced to her left, to the north, to where Berwick was situated, a trading port with beach markets that traded with Picts, Angles, Saxons, Britons, anyone who had money to spend on anything traders brought in. That would be her home soon, Osrith thought, Berwick, where Sainid had his land. She cared for him, and loved him in a sense. It was a good choice. "Won't you come to Bibbenberg, Lady Osrith?" Hald asked her. He was a good man, kind of heart. Osrith knew they could be safe there. "No," Osrith told him. "Give my best wishes to my brother, Hald," she told him, "and to all at my old home. I must support him by supporting whatever battle might unfold." And with that, Osrith drew her horse round, young Finan in her wake, ignoring the cry of, "My lady." As she took the road west, 88,888,888 a less friendly welcome was offered to Osrith when she arrived in the vicinity of the camp on the northern bank of the Tyne. Banners of King Edward of Wessex flew from every tent and, unlike at Bibbenberg, whose walls were its greatest strength, this encampment was instead protected by a good deal of men, many of whom were riding towards Osrith, swords raised. They had arrived a day later than Osrith intended, for she had forgotten that her 8-year-old son was much slower than she was and needed to stop more, and Osrith had told herself to be patient. She would never intend to go to war with the child, and only when she saw the West Saxon camp did Osrith realize that, well, she had an 8-year-old child with her. He could not go on the battlefield, and now, she knew, it was likely that she could not either. Osrith did not withdraw Buey, instead she slowed her pace, young Finan behind her, nudging the nose of his pony against the flank of her horse. But he sat proudly, and was not shying away as the West Saxons drew nearer. "Why do you approach us?" one voice called out, as the dozen or so mounted men made a line, a barrier, in front of them. "Who are you?" "You don't look Norse," said another. "Are you Norse?" Osrith tried to think of a withering response in Saxon to the stupid question. "Do they look Norse?" another asked. The voice of the first soldier looked over Osrith, her hair braided, her face defiant. "He looks Danish to me," said the second. "Danish?" asked Osrith in Saxon. "I am English, you fool." A scrape of iron accompanied her insult, but she simply shook her head. "Who's in charge here?" She looked at the first man. "You? Do you serve King Edward? Or are you a paid donkey in Ethelelm's pocket?" The first two men looked at one another, and then back to Osrith. "This is King Ed's camp," another said. Osrith looked at him, and into a face of someone she knew. "Miral?" she asked, in astonishment. "Why are you in West Saxon uniform, and not Merson?" The man shook his head, and did not smile. "I do not know you," he told her, coldly. "My brother is Miral of Mercia. I am Elfberh. I have always been West Saxon." He glanced to the other speakers. "So that my men do not kill you, identify yourself." "Osrith," she told him, just as coldly. "Osrith of Alba." "Although I do not know that Miral has ever told me he has a brother." And then Elfberh withdrew his blade. He pointed it towards Osrith and then swung it in an arc and pointed behind him. "The Mersons are over there," he told her. "Behind us, a mile west, are the men of Alba, Strathclyde, and so on. And, as to whether Miral told you he had a brother, we have not spoken to one another for over 40 years. But, Osrith said, and then stopped. Clearly, this was going to take some negotiation. "I once served the King of Wessex, the current king," she clarified. "I was in service under King Alfred, and then Lord Ethelred of Mercia, and, over there," Elfberh told her, "there are your Mersons." Osrith made to ride on with young Finan, but the barrier of men closed tighter. "You will need to go round," Elfberh continued. "Round?" Osrith asked, confused. Corbridge's pack horse bridge was just to the side of one of the guards. "There's the bridge, and, round," Elfberh told her, with a smirk that Osrith remembered had been just like Miral's, when he had been in forced service to Lord Ethelelm over a debt in Mercia, and had taken his annoyance out on everyone. "Back where you came from, across the Tyne at the sea, then along the southern bank." The guards tittered at her expression. "Or, I could fight you," Osrith told Elfberh. And, after a pause, the whole line of men exploded into laughter. "You fight me?" Elfberh laughed. "Woman, you couldn't." But Osrith turned to young Finan and tied her bridle to his rein, and told him not to move. "Matter!" he shouted, but Osrith had already slid down from her horse's saddle. Elfberh, similarly, had dismounted, and was holding his sword at arm's length. Buey, meanwhile, rested happily in Osrith's hand. Elfberh laughed as he danced from foot to foot, clearly proud of himself at having such an easy challenge before him. But Osrith did not wait. That gave the enemy time to think, and Osrith had already thought several moves further ahead than Elfberh it would seem. for he began badly with a misstep and was now on the defensive. "You piece of Alba-shit!" Elfber cried as Buey sliced across the back of his hand in the onslaught. "You, stop!" A cry came from behind the West Saxons, who parted to let the man through, who continued to shout, "Stop, stop I say!" Elfberg heard, and he staggered to a stop. Osrith, meanwhile, ignored the call, and pushed through, elbowing the man in the ribs, before catching his feet with one of her own, tumbling him to the summer hard ground. There was a thud, and a gasp as Elfber was winded. Osrith stood over him, blade at his throat. "Osrith, stop, I say!" And she turned to see Edward. 88,888,888. The last time Osrith had seen Edward, son of Alfred, when she travelled to Winchester to ask him to send an army to support Ethelred to Tenhulk. That had been nearly 8 years ago, and, had he not been wearing Alfred's crown of emeralds, Osrith might never have recognized him. Edward was younger than she was, by a few years, but, since the death of his father, at the relentless head of a West Saxon army repeatedly repelling Danes in East Anglia and then liberating the land, installing burghs and civic leaders, time had caught up with him. He was greyer and more lined even than Uhtred, who was 10 years his senior. As leader of the most powerful Saxon kingdom, Edward had pushed up the eastern edge of East Anglia and into Northumbria as Ethelfled had done in the west, the Anglo-Saxon border inching ever further towards Eothwick, Cumbraland and the Wall. Edward looked tired, and he looked ill. But there was still in his eye the twinkle that made people accede to this man and follow him as king. And he had taken Eothwick, Uhtred's insurance which had left Sigtryggr as its king, and gone beyond even Dunham, joining with Mercia across the river to conquer all to the Wall. Nearly. For Constantine stood between them, and Weir at Bibbenberg. And now Ragnall threatened all their interests. "Osrith," he breathed, as she trod towards him. "You do not need to fight my headguard." As he ordered me to make a large detour to get to the Mersins, I felt I had no choice. "Your Grace," Osrith replied, and bowed at the waist to her former lover. "Come now," Edward told her, and pushed past his guards. "It seems we have a lot to discuss." And his eye landed on young Finan for a moment, before holding out a hand. "Elfber, take the lady's horse, and the young gentleman's too." Edward looked back, and smiled at Osrith. "Come with me. I feel we have a lot to discuss." 88,888,888. It reminded Osrith of Domhnall on his throne, in the encampment at Dunad, before his coronation. Then, he had worn the cloak of blue that Constantine favoured, and received men and their oaths. Now, Edward, his bones creaking as his father's had creaked, wore nothing to signify kingship except for a determined expression that just wanted to get the job done. Just like Alfred, Osrith thought again. "I am glad to see you are all together," Osrith told Edward. The West Saxons, the Mersins, both side by side to Constantine's army. And the determination held, for Edward paced towards her and gave her the smile that had beguiled her so many times before. "I am glad unity pleases you," he told her. "But, why are you here?" "I need to get across the river, to Mercia, to continue my debt of time in the service of that beloved kingdom, and to see her comrades again, to see Eglafrith and Miral, Oshir and Falkbald and Elfkin, to stand shoulder to shoulder with her friends once more." "Oh, Osrith," Edward gasped, and turned away, and they were Atheling and servant once more. He was a child and she just a little older. "My sister is dead," he told Osrith, and bent his head, running his hand through his hair. "Ethelfled." And she had to resist running to his arms, to embrace the king. What did she die of?" Osrith asked, unable to stop herself from stepping towards Edward and touching his shoulder. What troubled her? "A canker." It grew, she could do nothing. And, at Edward's bald words, Osrith felt tears behind her eyes, and she could do nothing to stop them falling from her eyes in racking sobs, sorrow overcoming her at the loss of the woman, shock that she herself felt this way. Edward, moving stiffly, crossed to her, and put his arms around her, and Osrith stepped to her once lover, and she let herself rest her head to his chest, before letting out another frame-quaking sob as he wrapped his arms around her, comfortingly, protectively. "I never knew you cared," Edward murmured to her ear, and she felt him give a single chuckle, remembering, as Osrith was remembering, all those times that Ethelfled had tried to trick them, tried to separate them, had bullied her little brother, had stolen from him. They had bonded through Ethelfled, through her childish assertions of dominance. "In spite of our differences," she told him, and Edward tilted her chin up and looked at her, and Osrith thought he was going to kiss her. Instead, he looked over her shoulder to young Finan, who was staring at them both. Before Osrith could do anything, however, footsteps came outside the tent and Edward backed away, formality dividing them once more. "Aethelstan," Osrith declared, and smiled despite herself. He was an easy young man to like, though his seriousness was even more in line with Alfred's personality. "Lady Osrith," he nodded. "Oh, my lord of Mercia, not lady, if you please," Osrith said to him. "I am come to fight with Constantine, with Mercia. Tell me, what has happened so far?" And Aethelstan did so, telling her about 3 columns of Norse that had come to the southern bank of the Tyne, determined to cross, and the repulsion of those Norse leaving them scattered. "Which should please King Constantine," Ethelfled concluded, nodding to his father as Edward listened too. "At least the terror is away from his western border. There is a lot of Northumbria to act as a buffer to Pitland, at least." "What?" he asked, watching as Osrith grinned weakly and shook her head. "No, I am sure you know, Lord, that Constantine has claimed as Alba all land south of the Forth, all land to the wall." "Constantine wants Bibbenberg?" Aethelstan asked, amazement in his voice. He either did not know, Osrith concluded, or was a very skilled actor. "No, he assumes Bibbenberg is his," Osrith clarified. "But he is not interested in owning it. Just owning the man who calls himself Lord there," Aethelstan told her, wryly. "Aethelstan, he needs you," Osrith insisted. "Constantine needs me?" Aethelstan repeated, the sun choosing that moment to push through the clouds above them, briefly, in its typical Northumbrian manner, lighting up the hair on his head to a rich, golden color. "Utad, he needs you. The battle is not yet won." When had she known that, despite everything, she wanted Utad to be the Lord of Bibbenberg? She did not know. But, saying it to the man who could make it happen felt right to her. "What will you give to hold your oath true?" "To Mercia." "My Mercia?" Aethelstan asked her. And she showed him. Buey, out of her scabbard, rested in Osrith's hand once more, and she felt like she was young again, with the determination and energy of youth. Aethelstan smiled. "Fine and big," she said to her son, and beckoned him to her. "You will remain with Edward, King of Wessex. You will tell him stories, the stories you know. And when you have finished I will be back." "Matter," he nodded, his upbringing in Alba revealed in his voice. Then he turned to the King of Wessex. "Yes, Your Grace." Young Finan could speak so many languages effortlessly and enchanted everybody with his storytelling. The Norse and Danes called such people skalds. Yet the Scots called them Seliockt, people who enchant by storytelling. Young Finan had that gift. Osrith hoped that the spell her son would weave would last until her brother was triumphant. But, which brother? As Osrith bent low over her horse's neck, accelerating over the lower plain of the northern hills, she wondered how she had come to choose Utad Ragnarsson, rather than Utad Elfriksson, her brother by her mother forced to marry her father's brother. There had been another Utad after him, by another marriage, yet that Utad had died in a fight instigated in Wessex, so she understood, by Uncle Utad, after he had been taken the last time he had tried to take Bibbenberg. It was not that she loved her elder brother Utad better, more, it was that it was the right thing to do, by law, by document. Alfred of Wessex liked law and document, and as such, she had favored his approach, as much as Utad had disfavored it. She had also witnessed the document that married her former lover Edward to Ecgwin, his young priest's daughter, who had birthed Aethelstan and Eadgyth. Law was there to protect the weak when the sword arms weren't there. "You ride well, Osrith," Aethelstan told her, as they approached the bridge. Across from them the tents stood away from the water's edge, horses tethered close to a spinney of trees further on. "Thank you, Lord Aethelstan," Osrith replied, following him onto the pack-horse bridge, the West Saxon guard parting to let them pass. Osrith grinned at them, especially at Elfberg, which said, "I'm taking a shortcut." Aethelstan, on the other hand, bowed his head in acknowledgement to the gesture, nobly humble, just like his grandfather. "How old is your son?" Aethelstan asked, as they trotted across the meadow towards the Mercen encampment. "He seems like a contented child." "He can be," Osrith admitted. "He's nearly 8. Aethelstan smiled. "I was that age when Ethelfled gave me a sword." Osrith smiled. "Oh, he's not quite there yet. It's a lot of effort getting him moving in a morning to the training ground." Now, if there was a sword training could be done by conjuring up verses of poetry, every enemy would be wiped out. "He looks a lot like his father," Aethelstan told her. "His father?" Osrith thought. "He means Constantine, of course." "Uted's swordsman?" he added. "Yes," Osrith replied, then fell silent. "A good guess." "Why?" "Unless it was a leading question." "Why Osrith?" Aethelstan asked her, glancing over towards his own guard, coming towards them, and he pulled up and turned his horse towards her. "My lord Bibbenberg, you went there before you came here, yet you advocate your elder brother." "Why?" And Osrith told him. "Because out of everyone, you are most like Uted. He needs you beside him to make sense of taking Bibbenberg, as he was beside Ethelfled. He'll be your lord in Northumbria." "Ha!" Aethelstan laughed. "You don't accept Constantine's claim to the land to the wall either, then? Or, is there another reason you wish him to attempt to take the fortress?" Aethelstan's voice had taken on a hard edge. "Is this a trap? Are you supporting Constantine's claim, or your other brother?" Osrith thought about that. There was the truth, and there were the reasons that she had been willing to share between Aethelstan and his father. "Because it's the right thing." "And to stop Constantine taking it," Osrith admitted. She glanced across to the men who were approaching. "Why would you want Constantine not to have it?" It was not the Mercens, it was the Mormers. Engus's tall, broad stature stood at first Phelim and Euonst beside him, their golden hair blowing in the wind. "Because it belongs to Uted," Osrith said, her voice quickening. "Law documents are important. Ignore them and there would worse chaos than Norse and Danes. It's the right thing to do." She approached Aethelstan, dipping her head to him. "When we come to the ridge you must let me ride on, to Constantine. You must pretend I have escaped you or offended you, shout your blackest curses at me, wave your sword. I will laugh at my supposed triumph." "Why?" "At Bibbenberg, the seawall contains a hole just under the arch. When Uted finally makes his move, you'll have to climb to the back. This brings you up into the chapel. Uted will need you." Aethelstan looked at her, blankly. "Are you sure?" "Bibbenberg, it's..." The Mormers were getting nearer. Engus had called her name. "Yes," Osrith replied, urgently. "I would not have left my son in the care of your father if I did not." "He will not harm him." Osrith turned her horse, and Aethelstan grabbed her rein. Perhaps a better actor than even she suspected. "Maybe not. But, he knows my heart and he will know of my love of my son, as he loves you." He had difficult choices to make under Ethelelm. "Why do you want Uted as Lord of Bibbenberg?" Aethelstan asked, his voice low as he clung to Osrith's rein. Memories of that day, that Uted had ridden to Bibbenberg with Subrig's head. How she had wanted to call out but was pulled away by the priest. Aidan, Elfric's household guard. How her hope and faith in life had been ignited. "You were sworn to my father," Aethelstan went on. His manner was altogether more threatening, however, and there was SHRMMM of sword blades out of the scabbards of the Mormers. "Yes, he does not need my protection anymore." Aethelstan smiled. "What about your love, Osrith? Does he need your love?" "He has my love, Aethelstan Aethling," she sighed as the Mormers neared. "When you were born, he was ecstatic. He knew marrying Ecgwin would be against his parents' wishes, against Alfred's plans. He did it anyway. He was the sunniest of children, the happiest of men. He could have seduced the blessed mother if he put his mind to it." Aethelstan's face went truly dark for a moment, but Osrith did not see. Even now she could feel Edward's hands trace the ligaments in her arms, her back, her stomach. Lord in heaven, he has my love. Osrith repeated, urgently, acting that she was trying to escape Ethelastan's bond. Because if I put my brother back in his ancestral home, he will do everything he can to bring about your grandfather's vision of a united Saxon island. And you will bring the petty kingdoms in Wales to your side, Strathclyde too. And Constantine? Osrith said nothing, merely waited for Angus getting to them first. I am to marry. A match has been proposed to me. She glanced to Phelim, who was glaring at Ethelstan. I will be no opposition to you when you return to Northumbria to unite the whole of this land when I farm my land at Berwick. Uthed may still have divided loyalties, however. But it was not just the Mormers who were coming. Behind them, and gaining fast, were another group of riders. Osrith seems to be in some difficulty with Lord Ethelstan, said Sihtric, when neither Finan or Uthed would say anything about why they were chasing Constantine's men. But a shout went up behind them, and a hammering on the trees. Warriors! Called the voice. It was Aldhelm. Warriors! Horses turned, Uthed bade his men turn, but the Mormers were not stopping until they had Osrith. But there was a commotion. Norse were in the field, beyond the group of trees. Men urged horses in the southwesterly direction,